So it's been posited that the reason there is a near universal aversion in humans to things like snakes and spiders is that this has been handed down to us generation to generation, and it's hard-coded into our brains from our DNA because of some threat that we've adapted to over the sort of evolutionary time. But that doesn't appear to be the case. In my last video, we talked a little bit about this lady who had lesions on her amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for acquiring fears. And as a result, she had acquired none, including these ones that we posited were universal. Turns out they're not. The only way that they could induce a fear response in her was to elevate her blood CO2 levels, that is, to simulate asphyxiation. That she still wasn't afraid of asphyxiation. The thought of asphyxiation still didn't quicken her pulse or release adrenaline or cortisol or anything like that. It was just the experience of being asphyxiated. So if there is something that we might be able to call hardwired, it's that. So barring the use of CO2 canisters at your D&D night, where does that leave horror creatives when it comes to deciding what to include as far as horror is concerned? There's no master list of things that we can say is intrinsically scary to human beings. There's no thing that is guaranteed to be scary. Well, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Matt. Welcome to the Tomb of Lime. So in experiments with infants, gotta love it when scientists get into that. We discovered that even children that were capable of recognizing faces only started showing fear responses to scary and distorted faces if they had been previously not exposed to those faces after about 6 months of age. During the first 6 months of life, we're taking all this raw sensory data and we're sorting it into categories to help us sort of navigate this strange new place. That's a person, that's a face, that's food, that's not food. Babies are very curious, but they're not particularly fearful up to a certain point. After about 6 months, when they've started to work out what is normal, it's things that they find, that they're not used to, things that don't fit into the categories that they set up that start to provoke fear responses in these children. There was a picture I saw of someone, that was posted to Facebook, and it was a picture of a Caucasian baby on a train somewhere, and he was smiling and laughing at a black man. And the caption was something like, "We are not born racist. Racism is taught." As noble a sentiment as that might be, I think, strictly speaking, only the first part of that is correct. We aren't born racist, although I'm sure it can be taught. It is enough that for a child to fear people that look different from they are used to simply by not being exposed to them. That's probably not a bad argument for diversity of representation in children's media, right? But having said that, there was an episode of Peppa Pig that was banned in Australia because it taught children not to be afraid of spiders. Some level of fear might be advantageous in certain circumstances. I mean, we have a fear response for a reason. Which brings us to our spiders and snakes and things. So why do they appear to be such a universal fear among human beings? Well, I think it's probably just because if your parents are good parents, you're probably not being exposed very intimately with things like spiders and snakes as an infant. They are sufficiently different from the categories that you set up as an infant that when you do encounter them, they provoke this response. We've seen the same thing in animals as well. A scientist called David Hebb in the 1940s did some experiments on chimps where, captive chimps who had not been exposed to a bunch of different things and then exposed them to things like snakes, and it provoked a response in them. Hebb continued to introduce novel objects and animals to the chimps and discovered something more subtle than just snake phobia, that chimps had alarmed and frightful responses to any extremely varied morphologies they encountered. So when there is a mismatch between what we perceive and the standing categories we have for how we understand the world, it produces fear and curiosity. There is no master list of scary things. So the content of our fears could be potentially anything, but it does seem like there is a format which is more universal. But there's some nuance here because we obviously have fear to things that fit very well within our categories. Dangerous animals, bears and tigers and whatever. And we can also find novel things, that we come across that provoke our curiosity without fear. So it seems to have the thing that we call horror. It's not just enough for fear or just mismatch. We need them both. We need some sort of threat and something that exists outside of our standing categories. And Noel Carroll, the philosopher I talked about last time, calls this fear and disgust. He calls that mismatch reaction disgust. So this might not be completely comprehensive theory of fear, but it's a pretty good place to start. And that is to invoke the sort of horror feeling. You need something that is fearful. That means it's threatening. It's got danger element to it. And something that causes disgust. That is something that exists outside of our standing categories, our understanding of the world. So simply being outside of the categories that we have, i.e. something that we just haven't encountered yet, is a valid way to produce this reaction. But it may be more and more difficult the more you age and the more different things you're exposed to. But perhaps a more useful way that we as creatives can use to create horror is to transgress categories by smushing them together, something Carroll calls category jamming. So you take the standing categories that you have an understanding of the world, and then you smush them together. Now, Matt, I hear you say, I have a category for peanut butter, and I have a category for strawberry jam. But when I smush these together, they make a very tasty sandwich. That may be true, but that's because peanut butter and strawberries are both also in the category sandwich fillings. In order to category jam, you need to pick things that never go together. You need to pick things that, if the Venn diagram of these two concepts, there is no overlap, something that is impossible given your current understanding of the world. We all knew a kid who had some recipe for a sandwich that they would make, and it would have the strangest combination of ingredients. And our first thought upon hearing these things, even if the ingredients separately were things we liked, hearing them put together made us feel disgust. We're basically doing that, except with broader concepts. So perhaps one of the most famous categories that gets jammed together for horror is alive and dead. No doubt I don't even need to give you examples of this because a bunch of them already came into your mind. But like there's a subset of this. H.R. Giger's work has often been described as biomechanical. So that's kind of alive and not alive as well. Organic and inorganic. Another great one is we have a very strong concept of what a human being is, all right? Because we are one, presumably. And so when you start to smush human and things that are never connected with human together, you get some very interesting horror concepts like human and fly, or human and pyramid, or human and camera, human and siren, human and safe, human and other human, or self. People have a very strong sense of self. So you transgress the category of self. It's kind of what you would call body horror. Like we swallow our own saliva all day. But if you were given a cup of your own saliva, you would have a disgust response if you were asked to drink it. How our body works out what is us and what is not us is a strong category that we have. And I think this is where things like doppelgangers and like amputated limbs and phantom limb and, the idea of things inside you, that sort of stuff, that is all transgression of the category of self. The face hugger from the Alien movie, that is taking some categories. There's quite a few there, but, that is essentially a vagina with a penis in it. And then a couple of movies later, Prometheus, they made a penis with a vagina in it. So one of the masters of category jamming is Ito Junji. This is probably one of his most famous works, Uzumaki. And Uzumaki is an exercise in jamming the concept of the spiral together with things that it shouldn't be combined with. And the spiral is just an abstract shape. We don't think of spirals and think of horror, but just combining it with things that it should never be combined with is a great source of that disgust response. He combines human and spiral. Actually, he combines human and smoke and spiral, human and insect and spiral. I think it just goes to show how broad category jamming can be and still be effective. It doesn't even need to be two things that are scary. It just needs to be two things that, there's no overlap of. I was worried at some point that horror was basically all just based around xenophobia and the human fear of other, and that exploiting this is going to get more and more distasteful as time goes on, that horror kind of had an expiration date. But Carroll convinced me otherwise. He basically said, you can set up a bunch of categories that you have and randomly combine them, and you will get some very sort of disgusting, horrific type things. And selecting randomly from categories, that has no, social or political push behind it, but it still might end up being effective horror. Categories also don't have to be like two physical things that you put together. Something that we consider vital for that category, if you take something away from it, that can cause disgust. For example, the headless horseman, or the faceless noperabor. If something belongs in a category has a size limitation on it, having that thing be bigger than your category allows makes it an object of horror. We might have accepted spiders into our standing categories and our understanding of the world, but then we've still got Shelob from Lord of the Rings, who is big enough to transgress the category that we have in our mind for spider, and suddenly it becomes a very, very scary version of a spider, or an impossible number of things. If we have in our category that there are only a certain number of things, when we meet that thing in nature, whatever it is, then having an unusually high number of them, a swarm of them, birds, whatever it is, can be an example of category jamming. Or when something simply appears to be in one category and then turns out to be in a different one, like someone that appears to be friendly but turns out to be an enemy. That might just be enough. There's a trend of using children as the object of horror because most people's concept of children is not harmful and dangerous and evil. And so by placing them in that position, we create that mismatch. Another set of categories that you can transgress is moral categories. So I think what takes a sort of serial killer thriller into horror is the kind of acts that the serial killer performs. If they're what you might describe as unthinkable, inconceivably evil, unfathomably evil, or whatever it might be, then you're on the right track. So I can't give you a formula for what is worth jamming together, but this is the bread and butter of our category jam sandwich. Sorry, as opposed to just fear. So get creative. Think of categories that you might have that have no overlap and then jam them together. And then all you have to do is add fear. And then you've got horror. So that's it. Fear and disgust. All right. RPG specifics. Let's do it. If the player characters in your RPG are nigh indestructible superhumans who only ever come into danger after a 18 round, 2 hour long tactical combat board game, then the sense of threat is dead in the water. Killing a red shirt NPC is not really going to be enough to make a character with 300 hit points feel in any danger. It's just not good enough. And the way that most D&D or like modern D&D type games are set up is that creatures that could kill a character very quickly are so ridiculously high level that they basically auto-hit and players can't hit them at all. It's just not a very good fit for horror. It feels less like hopelessness in the face of fear and more just like pointlessness in the face of unfair mechanics. Horror in modern D&D, more often than not, is just horror set dressing. We've reskinned the monsters so that they're spooky. But I think any advice for horror in D&D should probably start with pick a different system. It's also going to be a problem if the horrific monsters in your fictional world don't transgress the categories of that fictional world. So Noel Carroll makes the observation that the Wookiees and werewolves of the 70s and 80s had a pretty similar morphology, but only one of them was an object of horror. It's established in the universe that Chewbacca is just one of the guys, but the werewolves in London or Paris or wherever, they're transgressions of the natural order. Actually, I think in Empire Strikes Back, right, they introduced the Wampa, who, for the sake of that movie, is essentially the horror Wookiee. And they established that by treating it differently. So in your RPG world, it's important that any creature that you want to be a source of horror can't just be another magical animal in the grand menagerie of the setting. They have to be something that transgresses the norms of that setting, as well as transgressing the categories of our world too. In the D&D setting, we have the Far Realm, and I think creatures from the Far Realm might, by definition, transgress the categories of the D&D setting. But if a wizard can just roll a monster knowledge check and know what it is, it automatically brings that into, the world's categories. So that kind of mechanic just doesn't really work for horror. It takes it out of horror, which brings me to another important point. Here's a little section from the RPG that I've been writing. With all this talk of the unknown and the fear it inspires, you might wonder why the world of is couched in science fiction, given reasons why hauntings are phenomena and not just some incomprehensible supernatural occurrence. Surely, when we can't comprehend or reason with the horror, it's scarier, right? Well, in many cases, yes, you're right. Ghosts and the spirits of folklore are often more frightening because they do not make any rational sense. But in an RPG, this can be detrimental to one of gaming's basic tenets: player agency. If the entities of your horror world do not have comprehensible rules that they follow, then ultimately the fate of the characters is at the whim of the GM, and the choices of the players are arbitrary. No one, except a particularly sadistic GM, will get any fun or reward out of a game like this, so makes sure that no matter how inscrutable its monsters appear, they still have some mechanical substructure governing their behavior so the players can have meaningful triumphs and meaningful failures. I think that for players to have agency, the horror monsters need to have some sort of mechanical substructure that they run on that interfaces with the game properly and that the GM can use to run them. But I do not think that players should be privy to what those rules are, or at least not all of them. You know, ghosts can move through walls, but they can also pick up objects and throw them. It's impossible, right? It's contradictory, but it's necessary for our category violation. So I think the IGM should have an idea of what exactly is going on or what conditions are necessary for those things to happen and stick to them. And the players should only get that information by working out what they can for themselves. And even then, probably never really being sure of anything. All right, so this one's a personal preference, but I appreciate enthusiasm in roleplay in an RPG, but when it comes to being a GM, I prefer to make sure things are explained more impartially. When you scan a room and then you've seen something strange, you kind of got to do a double take as your brain lags behind what you've seen. And I think if you describe horror kind of like that, sort of mixing in the mundane and the horrific in equal emphasis, it kind of has the same effect. And in fact, describing horrific things in an unhorrified way is actually a category mismatch. So I think that actually helps to add to the unease that the players have. But, again, that's just, I've found that effect, but it is just my preference. So I can't tell you how many hit points or what mechanics a horror monster should have. But I can tell you that in order for it to be effective horror, you should invoke fear and disgust. That is, you should have real threat, and you should transgress our categories and the categories of the fictional world that you're playing in. I would love to hear what your favorite horror monsters are, and for bonus credit, I would love to hear what categories you feel that they transgress. So let me know. So I hope this has given you some ways to think about and approach horror design, and maybe to analyze the horror that you come across in a new way, and hopefully that will end up influencing and helping you to run your next horror session. But until next time, my name's Matt. This is the Tomb of Lime. Thank you very much for listening.